Hello, everybody. This is JJ Hardy with Victory Leadership Coaching and DB the Therapist he's got his own company that's called Derek Brown SESW.
That's
And
right.
we are here for another episode of Warrior Leadership. And sorry, technical issue. Doesn't look like it's going to be streamed to LinkedIn. Okay. Don't
We
know
just
why.
keep rolling.
I'm just going to keep rolling. Okay. I don't like it when there are technical issues. Anyway, we're rolling with it. So today on Warrior Leadership, we're going to talk about the foundations of emotional intelligence. And this is actually going to be a 4-part series. And
Wow.
this is only week 1. And who knew you could talk so much about emotional stuff? Well, we're going to start today and we're going to talk about emotional intelligence. So the first of 4, we're going to talk about self-awareness. And then next week, we're going to go into self-regulation. Then we're going to move into empathy and finish off our 4-part series with talking about social skills. And that's going to kind of put emotional intelligence kind of in a 360 point of view. And we're going to try to cover as much as we can with only 30 minutes at a time. But I'm going to go ahead and start off with saying self-awareness. DB the therapist. I got to know from a therapist standpoint, what the heck is self-awareness all about?
Self-aware. Wow. That's, you know, awareness of the self, right? So literally, it simply means that do you really take a fearless moral inventory of who you are? And it really points to identity, coach. I mean, you really have to really know who you are. And, a lot of often, I talk about defectiveness schema a lot. When someone has a defectiveness schema, meaning a ideology about who they think they are based on trauma, hurt, or any past, you know, history, that will affect their self-awareness of how they view themselves and how they view themselves, how they show up in the world. And quite often, I see people struggling with that. And it's the first sort of challenge that individuals face when they come into therapy, is this not having that self-awareness. Like those on the outside of in their family system and in their community or work environment, are seeing certain traits and behaviors in them, and yet they don't see those individual traits necessarily. And so that's what quite often brings people to therapy.
That makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people have, especially today in the technology generation, it seems like most people don't even have awareness of their surroundings to begin with, let alone self-awareness and understanding who they are, because they're constantly sliding up on a screen. But the 2 bullet points that you kind of sent to me earlier is understanding how to recognize your own emotion and understanding how they can influence your actions. And
Mm-hmm.
so I don't mention this on most of my podcasts, but I do have post-traumatic stress disorder. And so what that brings up for me, and I'll also transition that to a leadership standpoint, is that when I feel like I'm triggered, it's the same as when I'm just regularly upset or I feel my emotions rising, in a leadership situation where I'm going to have a difficult conversation or something. It's that heat that starts in your belly
That
and it starts rising.
yes.
Sometimes it rises a lot faster than I want to, and I don't have enough time to stop it. And then, you might be dealing with a different JJ. But,
Right.
for the most part, I am very, very good, especially in a leadership situation, in a professional environment, either, and this is my recommendation to everybody, you got to pay attention to that. Because if you can't stop yourself, you need to find a way to pull yourself back from the situation and, try to figure out a way to calm down. If you can stop yourself and continue, then, you can continue on in that moment. But when you are emotionally charged, in a professional environment or even in a personal environment at home, you're going to say things that you wouldn't normally say. You're going to act ways that you wouldn't normally act, and you're going to do and say things that you probably don't mean.
Right.
And that's not the way you want to portray yourself, because from, again, this is leadership side, not the therapy side, but I'm sure it relates, and he's going to get to that. But if you want to create influence in your environment, the fastest way to lose credibility and to lose that opportunity to create influence is to let your emotions get to an unhealthy point and blow up like an idiot.
Yes. Yeah. And JJ, that's so powerful, and that's kind of, that really is giving them a little bit of teaser of next week. I'm so excited to get into actual emotional regulation, right? The actual nuts and bolts of just that regulating our emotions, but in that very basic way of just knowing yourself, right? I think something that we learned in school is very early on is helper know thyself, right? It's so important to know who you are. And, just like you, I also have complex PTSD as well. I mean, that's what brought me to this field. At the end of the day, one of the things that's very important is that we write a personal statement when we go in graduate school in order to get in. And that one of the things they ask us about, those issues and things like that we may struggle with. And none of us are shy in explaining that, yes, this is something that I have, but that's not who I am. And I think it's so important to, when we talk about diagnoses, and whether it be PTSD, depression, anxiety, even schizophrenia, even some of the more severe and maybe individuals are lower functioning, it doesn't necessarily mean that's their identity. And we live in a world where, a lot of times when we put those labels on people, we identify them as those things. And so there's a lot of stigma around mental health for that reason. And so folks aren't really willing and forthright to come forth with that information. And I think it's amazing that, if you look at, who we are as individuals, as just professionals, how we carry ourselves. And you made a really good point in terms of credibility. And so for me, it actually makes me more credible as a therapist. Matter of fact, without me ever even self-disclosing of my diagnosis to my clients, they know who I am based on when they look at me in my eyes, and they know where I come from, and they look at my background and where I grew up, which I'm very open with, where I graduated from college and all that. And so when they know those things about me, I mean, they can more or less use their imagination, if you will, and determine that, okay, this man has been through something in his life, and therefore he's been resilient, which, I'm really excited to next week kind of go into resilience. As you can see, I'm getting excited about that, because, that zone of resiliency and the tools that we utilize in therapy to help people stay in that zone of resiliency, you can really overcome a lot of adversity in terms of mental health. Another thing that I want to say real quick about knowing yourself, Aristotle said this. He said, knowing yourself is the beginning of wisdom. I think that's very powerful, right? Just this idea of wisdom. And the wisdom is so important because quite often we hear about ego, right? Everyone's always talking about ego and ego tripping. And when I first started learning about psychology, my first teacher was Sigmund Freud. And although he's gotten a lot of bad rap in the past over some of his thoughts, the idea of id, ego, and superego are still very important concepts in which to understand human behavior. And superego is really the seat of wisdom, right? And so what that's simply saying is that when I know myself, then I can start developing that superego, and I'm less likely to give in to the impulsive desires of my id, which is exploding and not managing my emotions in a proper way. And knowing yourself is really that very important the beginning part of self-awareness and emotional intelligence, man.
So it's interesting, there are leadership principles that the military has in place already. And one of those sticks out when you're talking about emotional intelligence. So we use the warrior ethos a lot. We talk about those a lot. in the group we're getting ready to start, we're going to be also displaying the Army values. Well, we might as well talk about the principles of leadership in the military as well, specifically the Army.
Yes.
The one I'd like to talk about, though, is to know yourself and seek self-improvement.
Yeah.
So that's important, because if you know that you are, and I won't even call it flawed, because technically speaking, we're all ignorant until we know something.
Yeah.
So, and there's nothing wrong with that. You have to understand that making mistakes is part of learning, and you don't know something until you know it. But when it comes to knowing yourself and seeking self-improvement, whether you find out from somebody else or you learn on your own, if you know that your emotions rising is something that you need to work on, the stigma in the United States military, and I don't give a dog on what all these senior leaders say. When you get down to the nuts and bolts of things, people think that you have to suck it up and drive on.
Mm-hmm.
When you have to go to appointments for anything, whether it's a broken leg or a sprained ankle or whatever you have to leave the mission for, it is looked at as a weakness, because you're taking away from your job. And that's just the truth of it. But when you have, especially up here, if you know you have a deficiency, and it's not a deficiency, I'm going to go into that in a second, but if you know that there's something you need to work on and you don't take steps to improve yourself with that, you're hurting yourself and you're hurting everybody around you.
Wow. And that is so good. And I can't wait till we get into the down the road. I mean, I'm pretty sure we're going to have a whole discussion about toxic leadership and how that leadership affects someone's emotions, right? And I think that's something that shows up real often in therapy. But I want to touch on a point that you just made that I also see in therapy. Some of my high value clients who come into therapy, they refuse to use their insurance and they rather pay cash. And the reason why that is, what I've come to learn, and I've asked this question over and over again, is that, they can now control the narrative. If they go through an insurance company, they know that that's going to be monitored. There's going to be more scrutiny on it. And so I'm seeing that as a, opportunity, right, to really be able to treat these people. And even with coaching, right, JJ, people are coming and it's private pay. And so there's more, I guess, privacy, if you will, if that makes sense. And so, there's this thing, so often we think of people who struggle with emotional issues or even mental health in general as people who are in poverty and are, may or may not be able to afford insurance, but really a lot of individuals who are at the top of their game are really struggling. And so there's this idea of, poor in spirit. And when you think about knowing yourself and thinking about these core beliefs that you just mentioned, the warrior ethos and being able to teach that from a coaching perspective. And I think that's where that bridge is between counseling and coaching, is when you can develop those core values and beliefs and constantly reinforce those things to yourself, which I think is very much a coaching strategy, right? Repetition, repetition, repetition. When you're able to do that with those core values and beliefs, it can really drive a person forward towards that awareness, right? You think about loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, honor, integrity, personal courage. Like as we start to really break those things down, people can lean on those things. And that's why a lot of times you see, these mantras that people come up with, like mind over matter, so it doesn't matter, things like that, right? You say things to yourself so that way you can pull yourself out of this funk that you're in. And so that, again, you have to know yourself in order to know what works for you. And so I think that's where coaching and therapy is so important, to be able to have a way in which to look at who you are today, because who you are today may not have been who you were last week or who you're going to be in the future. And so being able to, I think it's a very powerful question that I ask people, and it gets them stumped every time, man. And it's who are you, right? How do you answer that question when a person asks you an open-ended question like, who are you? And I ask every single person that I've ever worked with that question on the first session, and that's their out of session growth assignment. And I always get this deer in the headlights look. And sometimes when they go home and they do the homework or the out of session growth work, they struggle with it, not being able to know who they are. And so, it's just really powerful, man, to start helping people explore that, because that also just points to their self-worth and their purpose, man.
You know what? I think I know what our challenge question is going to be for the day.
What's that? Ah, look at that. I slipped that in there on you, huh?
And you know what? If you didn't figure that out by listening in the past minute or two, you'll find out at the very end. Okay. That's all I'm going to say about that. Because I don't repeat myself very often, so I'm not going to do it now. I'll wait till later.
Yes, sir. Yes, coach.
So self-awareness, this is going to go into our social skills and self-regulation, but I want to bring something to the surface that we talked about, and I want to circle back to PTSD. There are a lot of people and a lot of employers out there that if they ever find out that somebody has PTSD, they automatically think that that's a weakness. Oh boy, are you wrong. Oh boy, are you wrong. Or girl, whatever, woman, man, lady, guy. But when you consider somebody who goes through a traumatic event and they come out of that and they conquer that, what type of person are they?
Oh, that's a good question.
If they continue to move forward on their mission and they still function every day after going through that traumatic event, and they do that for years after that, and then they're in front of you after dealing with all of that, what kind of person are they?
Can I answer that?
Oh, yeah. I have a different way to say it, but I would like to hear how you say it first.
Oh, yeah, I know. I have a very colorful way to say it.
Please.
As well, but this is a PG-13 audience, so I'm going to say they're a warrior. They're a freaking warrior. Whoa, 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 whoa. They are a warrior. Yes, JJ. Great question.
Yes, they are warriors. And you know what? They're not just warriors, but their very creed and their ethos say that they are warriors and a member of a team. So if you bring that person into your workplace and make them a member of your team, what do you think you just did? I'm not going to answer that for you, but it is a strength, not a weakness. And in the wise words of Forrest Gump, that's all I'm going to say about that.
Yes, sir. And you know what, man? I'm going to tell you this, and you just made me want to open this up, and I'm going to be real transparent right now. One of the greatest warriors in my life is my mother. My mother was a recovering drug addict, and she did a couple things that I'm just going to drop real quick. Is the one thing that she did that really impressed me is that no matter how many times she relapsed, she would come back harder and fight harder each time, just like you said, to the point where one time she relapsed and came back. She ended up working her way up to assistant manager at Walmart and was actually on her way to becoming the manager. Her last act before she passed away, this lady walked the stage with stage 4 cancer in her body and got her AA degree after failing an algebra class 5 times, sir. My mother is a freaking warrior. And so when you see Derek Brown show up, I show up the way I show up because I had such a great leader in my life in spite of what she went through. And you know what? I think that's so important. When you think about self-awareness, it's also being aware of those who have came before you. And so when you have that real awareness and what people have gone through, like each one of us has that person in our life, whether it's our mom, our grandmother, whomever. We like to focus on the people who were not there. But what about the people who, like you said, continue to fight hard and persevere and go through, like having that awareness of other people and what they did, right? Because they dug deep as well and they looked within themselves and they pushed forward. And so as you get through that grief, and this is where it's very powerful in therapy, where you see someone go through grief and loss, and then you help them discover the positives and the silver lining, even in trauma. That's the essence of being a warrior, right? When you think about sucking it up and drive on, and coach, you really helped me remember this about my military service, which is we have to do AARs at all time, and that's an after actions review. And no matter what happens in life, whatever it might be, the loss of a loved one, the loss of a job, the loss of a relationship. We see that all the time. And so because of those things, we look at those things and the ability to overcome those things. It takes that warrior ethos to be able to get through it. And so one of the things that I really love about what we're doing is we're really bridging this gap and helping people see that they're a part of a larger community. 1% of the people in this country serve in the United States military, but in reality, what percentage of these people in our country are actually warriors based on the ethos that they live by?
That's true.
I wonder what percentage, JJ. We need to discover that, man.
I think we need to look that up. But you also touched on something that's very important, and you touched on the AAR. And when I think of self-awareness, if you don't really know who you are, that question that you posed earlier, who are you? You know, when you are going through something difficult and you don't understand why you react the way you do, an AAR is a way to do that. So an AAR is to figure out what went right there. And then you try to figure out what went wrong there. And then you take it to the next level and you figure out what you can sustain with that situation. So what out of that was good enough that you would do it again?
Mm-hmm.
And then what would you improve? So what's something that didn't go so well, and what would you do differently? Don't just say that things went poorly. That's a really cynical way to look at things. You have to always think in improving. So what can you do better? Because you can always do better. Don't sit there and get stuck. If you don't know what you can do better, then talk to somebody who's been there and figure that out. If you want to know who you are and always be better, an AAR is one way to do it. And, you can do that with positive and negative situations. Mm-hmm. What went right there? Because you know what? In a great situation, you can still improve.
Mm-hmm.
A great situation. I just got a promotion. Well, you know what? What went right there? What went wrong there? What can I sustain and what can I improve? Because you know what? That new role is going to need a different you.
Mm-hmm.
So those are just things. And when I think of emotional intelligence and self-awareness, a lot of times people fail to check in with themselves. And if you don't check in with yourself, and an AAR is only one way to do it, talking to a friend, talking to your colleagues and asking them questions, talking to your spouse, your kids, always trying to find what's going right and what's going wrong. And whether you react well in that moment or not, listen to the feedback. Mm-hmm. and heed the truth. The truth is not easy to consider sometimes, but you still have to. Because if you can't criticize yourself, then you have no business criticizing other people.
Absolutely. And JJ, that second point about understanding how those thoughts, there's that awareness, right, of what the emotion is, and understanding understanding ourselves. But there's also understanding how that affects behavior, right? And I think one of the things that is a very powerful tool is keeping a thought record. That's something that is really easy to implement. People make it harder than what it is. And I hear excuses all the time on why people don't complete thought records when I have them do them, right? Well, my wife's going to find it and I don't want them to see it. My husband's going to find it. Don't want him to see it. Well, write it in your phone. Your phone is likely locked. Well, it's important to capture those thoughts. When we capture those thoughts, what we're able to do is we're able to discover universal thoughts, or what we call stuck points, that end up leading to these negative emotions that, as you talked about earlier, will ultimately always lead into a explosion, meaning someone else getting hurt on the outside, or imploding, us hurting ourselves. And so it's so important to capture those thoughts using thought records, using these different tools that are readily available. And there's tools that we use in therapy. I'm sure you have something similar in coaching where you help clients really understand it. And you've even helped me just from a business perspective really slow down. And you always talk about keeping the end in mind. And so there's this idea of having a framework, right? Having a framework to go about life. And I think there's another concept that we talk about in it's dialectical behavioral therapy, and the concept is called wise mind, where when we're in this highly emotional state, how do we shift over to the center of that Venn diagram, which is where logic meets in the middle? And so the more and more we ask questions and we write things down, we slow down that automatic response to want to react, right? And I think as warriors, that's one of the things that we learn how to do really well. We know how to, like, you remember this concept. I'm gonna say it, I'm gonna drop it. Hurry up and wait, right? I know you don't like to hear it, but yet it's something so important, that's slowing down. And so that wise mind concept, it allows me to slow down, ask questions, move myself towards the center, and I have balance, and I'm less likely to respond. I want to make one more point. I want to come against this stigma that veterans who have PTSD, police officers who have a condition, have a lack of self-control. The opposite is true. As a matter of fact, they're less likely to respond because they are well trained in terms of being able to identify what that real visceral response is in their body. Even if they may not be able to label the emotion right away, they know when they're heating up, and they know how to get out of the kill zone, right? We're always taught that. Get out of the kill zone, get out of that danger zone. And I think as you come into spaces like therapy and coaching, once you get that tool, you'll be able to be a lot more effective at really controlling your emotions. But I think at their core, those individuals are actually very selfless people. And so the intent of their heart is not to cause harm. But one thing I will say all the time is when anger is high, cognition is low. And we know that anger is the tip of the iceberg emotion. And so therapy and coaching, I would agree, helps us explore those other emotions and get underneath. And that's that, again, emotional intelligence. And when we can get the IQ and the EQ to be in line with each other, man, there's some powerful things that can happen in the life of an individual. That's how you develop that warrior mindset, man.
I completely agree with that. And I want to add that we're getting close to 30 minutes here, but I want to add to what you just said, even though I've already done my piece on PTSD. The reason that people are quick to react when they have PTSD is because that's what their brain has been trained to do. So oftentimes when there's not a constant threat or a constant action that they have to take, that immediate action comes out in other less desirable ways. And I hate to say it, but it is very, very true. When you're taken out of the action, your brain wants to still take action. And when you're put into a high stress work environment, that makes you stronger, because then you have the ability to, as soon as that adversity starts to hit, I don't care if it's that report being due in an hour, you're going to take action, and you will fire on all cylinders. And you're probably going to have people around you saying, why the heck is he trying so hard? It's just a report. But you know what? It's because we always place the mission first, and we never accept defeat, and we never quit.
Yes, sir.
PTSD is not a weakness. It makes us almost superhuman.
That's quotable, sir.
So that's self-awareness. Know who you are, and don't be afraid to figure out how to improve. And on top of that, once you figure out how to improve, don't stop improving, because when you stop taking motion, I mean, what happens to a plant that stops growing? I was just told this yesterday, so I'm going to use it again. It's dying.
Yes.
So if you stop moving forward and you stop, then you lose momentum, and ultimately you start digressing in whatever you're doing. And so it's understand who you are. That's great. but always figure out ways to improve. Get 1% better every day. That's not a huge chunk. There's always something you can be doing better, whether it's saying a nice thing to another person or it's improving yourself in your craft and whatever that may be. I don't care if you're a professional floor sweeper. Get better at it. But it's very important to understand that being self-aware and understanding your emotions and getting to that next step that we'll talk about next week of self-regulation. Yeah. First you have to understand that emotion. You have to understand where it comes from, why it's there, and when it explodes so that you can, Warren G said it too, regulate. I'm sorry, that was cheesy. DB, what do you got for closing comments for the day?
I'm not saying nothing after that Warren G. That was classic. Now I'm gonna go listen to it after this. Matter of fact, you know what? I almost feel like turning it on. I'm almost feel like turning it on for the road. Like that was, I was like, boom, my hair started bobbing like this when you said that. Like, if you know,
I knew that would get you excited, man.
I'm just saying, man. Woo!
All right, y'all. I tell you what, anyone who watched this or anybody who does watch this in the future, like it, subscribe to it, repost it, share it, but most importantly, keep the conversation going. And I feel like a broken record, but I'm going to go ahead and call y'all out. You're not doing it. So let's make action happen and get this important information. If you feel that way, you can feel like we're garbage too. That's okay. But I don't think that's what you feel. So if you like what we have to say, keep the conversation going and pass it right along. This is JJ Hardy and DB the Therapist signing out.